This is a presentation for Chapter 2, Job Order Costing. In Learning Objective 4, we will learn how to record the completion and sales of finished goods. During the year, Smart Touch Learning has been accumulating, assigning, and allocating the cost of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead to jobs. Now we're going to learn how to account for the completion and the sale of those jobs and how to adjust manufacturing overhead at the end of the period. The first transaction we are going to look at is how to record the cost of goods manufactured for the jobs that have been completed. So normally we would make a journal entry each time an individual job is completed, but for our purposes we're just going to look at one summary entry. So for all of the goods that have been completed by Smart Touch Learning during 2026, we would debit finished goods inventory and credit work in process inventory. So the total amount of cost of goods manufactured was $644,600 in 2026. Now, as the jobs are sold, Smart Touch Learning would need to record an entry for the sale of the goods and an entry to record cost of goods sold. So again, we are looking at summary entries. If Smart Touch Learning sold $1,200,000 of goods with a cost of $584,600, they would need to make an entry first to record the sale by debiting accounts receivable and crediting sales revenue for the $1,200,000, and then they would make another entry to record the cost of goods sold by debiting cost of goods sold and crediting finished goods inventory for $584,600. These T accounts show the transfer of the completed goods from work in process to finished goods inventory that we recorded in transaction 9, and then the cost of goods sold for the goods that are actually sold that we recorded in transaction 11. Now we notice that there is still a balance in work in process inventory at the end of the year. The $27,000 debit balance would represent the goods, the jobs that are still in process that have not been completed. And we also see a debit in finished goods inventory for $60,000. That debit would represent the goods that have been completed but not yet sold. In Learning Objective 5, we are going to learn how to adjust manufacturing overhead when it is over or under allocated. If you remember, Smart Touch Learning has been allocating manufacturing overhead to the jobs using a predetermined overhead allocation rate that is based on estimates. So at the end of the year, an adjustment would be required to manufacturing overhead. So manufacturing overhead will be under allocated if the actual manufacturing overhead costs were more than the amount that was allocated to the jobs during the year. Manufacturing overhead would be over allocated if the actual manufacturing overhead costs were less than the amount that was allocated during the year. So let's look at what happened with Smart Touch Learning. During the year, Smart Touch Learning recorded all of the actual cost of manufacturing overhead as debits to the manufacturing overhead account. Then, as the manufacturing overhead was allocated to the individual jobs, a credit was made to manufacturing overhead, and if you remember, a debit to work in process inventory. At the end of the year, manufacturing overhead had an unadjusted balance of $15,400. So that means that the actual manufacturing overhead costs were more than the amount that was allocated to the jobs. Manufacturing overhead is a temporary account, so it needs to have a zero balance at the end of the year. Since it is underallocated, we need to adjust it by debiting cost of goods sold for $15,400 and crediting manufacturing overhead for the same amount. This slide shows the T accounts for manufacturing overhead and cost of goods sold. As we noted in the previous slide, manufacturing overhead was underallocated. The actual costs were more than the amount that had been allocated to work in process inventory. So manufacturing overhead needs to be adjusted by debiting cost of goods sold and crediting manufacturing overhead, as we did in transaction 12. After that entry is made, the balance in manufacturing overhead is zero, and cost of goods sold now reflects the actual amount of $600,000. And that is the completion of the presentation for learning objectives 4 and 5.